Good evening. Welcome to the meeting, gentlemen. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 6:02 p.m. Everyone will please take note of the emergency exit and stand and join me for the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Giller,
Here.
Mr. Jackson,
Here.
Mrs. Snyder,
She will be arriving shortly.
Mrs. Gendron. Here. Ms. Paradis,
Excused.
Mr. Jaros,
Excused.
Mrs. Carey.
Here. Thank you, Mrs. Chairman. I'd like to turn the floor over to Superintendent for the district reports.
Good evening, everyone. So the first part of this evening's meeting is our Code of Conduct public hearing. And I first want to just give a little outline. So the code will be posted on our website tomorrow for a 30-day public comment period. And then it'll be on the last meeting in August for recommendation of adoption, and then shared with all staff, given to new staff upon hire. So we always have given a plain language summary code, and last year through discussion with the board, the request was, let's make sure that we have a summary code that meets the needs of all of our students. So a secondary, intermediate, and primary level version. We did that last year, and it was helpful, and we will be doing that again. And this will be reviewed with staff at our opening meetings, as is our policy, some of the key highlights, and then also reviewed with students in assemblies and in classes at the beginning of the year. So this is simply the sections of the Code of Conduct, the rights and responsibilities of central partners. We went through this, you might recall last year, there was a lot of changes in the code, and there were really areas that we needed to revise to meet our needs. There are very few suggested revisions this year. One thing, as we were going through the essential partners, we realized that in a couple areas we had missed talking about trauma responsiveness and talking about personal bias. So we made sure that that language was throughout, knowing that no matter what the code, the consequences, it is very important to understand that many of our students are coming to us and have experienced some trauma and might react either through fight, flight, or freeze. And so how can we de-escalate that? And we have a lot of training with Rachel Marcel this year for all staff around that. Prohibited student conduct. So last year, again, a lot of changes made. That was when we were initially struggling with the repercussions of the legalization of marijuana in our schools. And we had really fine-tuned that language to allow administrators to give appropriate consequences. Video recording of fights, videos on cell phones. We had adapted all of that language last year as well. DASA violations, we had made sure that we included information regarding our Dignity Act coordinators in the code. So in going through the code this year, as I mentioned, really the only recommendations in the code were to add trauma responsiveness and avoiding bias language to any area where it wasn't previously included. In talking with administrators and then talking with their staff, it was felt that the code, because of the thorough revision the year previously, met all the needed changes. I do want to talk a little bit of some implementation of the code. So there are pieces in the code that talk about restorative practices, that when certain things happen, that there can be a practice or something assigned to the student in lieu of a disciplinary consequence. So in going through Edgenuity this year, at the high school, Laura has informed me that there are many pieces of that that can be used. So for example, if a student is having trouble smoking with tobacco, there's smoking cessation components in Edgenuity. I mean, we do have our social workers meet and talk, but there's also things that can be assigned for students through Edgenuity, and that's just one example. And we're going to go through and highlight some of that. So I think that's a big benefit. I mentioned trauma responsiveness. We moved from CPI, crisis prevention intervention, to TCIS, therapeutic crisis intervention for schools, which means we've moved from a 2.5 day training to a 5-day training in that area. Very, very intensive. But the whole first component is about de-escalating behavior and co-regulation, and how to make sure that if a student is is at a level of anxiety or behavior, your behavior really needs to come way down here. So looking at how outside of the staff, because of the roles, need the 5 days, how to take those initial days and make sure all staff can have it. In our building leadership team meetings, it was brought up, what a great idea for opening day, to just make sure that there was, to make sure that there was a broad understanding, and then further fine tune from there. So just wanted to add those few things, more to come from the administrators throughout the year.
So can I just ask, how we make it accessible for, an alternate discipline, restorative practice, if we're using Edgenuity at the high school, but not at any of the other buildings? Because we know and have heard that these behaviors are starting earlier, especially, those, attached with vaping and potentially tobacco or marijuana use, like we're hearing that it's happening earlier. So how do we make that available for kids who aren't in the high school?
So a few different things. I just learned about the addition with Edgenuity relatively recently, like today, so just in time. So that I'm not quite sure how licenses go, but I'm sure we can look into how can we utilize some of those licenses, and talk about for where, the grade levels that might be appropriate for. As you know, too, the middle school is, and she's on the agenda this evening, getting an additional social worker as well this year. And that person is going to be meeting, not as a disciplinarian, but meeting, with students and solution-focused groups for some of these things. But I will get more details about Edgenuity and make sure that Mrs. Tarlow and Mr. McFarland are talking for the future. I think
even like if it's included in a broader, sense to say, available resources, it may be that having a social worker one-on-one with a student at the middle school is far more effective than putting them in front of the screen. Just, being careful about the language so that it's not, putting us in a box to say, this is what we say we're gonna do, but just being a little flexible about those things.
That shows up as part of the range of consequences.
so. The range for the smoking cessation, that shows that has a range of consequences.
All of those kind of restorative or
Restorative
in
intention.
lieu of suspension, I do.
It's in the range of consequences. Okay, thank you. And then I just wanted to update you, at our last meeting, we talked about the district-wide safety plan and that there were proposed changes. So the state has adopted the proposed changes, again, about trauma-informed drills, students and staff to be informed when the school is conducting a drill. There were some revisions and some clarifications of that when adopted. One is, and we really tried to do this But the drills must be conducted on different dates as well as days of the weeks and times of the day. I think that one is a good one for when there might be drills that have happened twice in a day. They must be on different dates. So that's something new. We question, what about the notification of drills for staff? We always notify when it is, a lockdown drill, but what is said. Evacuation drills, students and staff do not need to be notified as consistent with the requirements of fire code. This is a change. We have been informing parents after the fact, but parents and those in parental relations must be notified 1 week before each drill. They don't have to be notified exactly when it will be, but just that sometime this week, a drill will be occurring so that they're aware, and we'll still follow up with the communication. But just so that if there is a drill before the communication goes out, everyone will know that at some point in time that week there will be a drill. So those are the changes. I just wanted to follow up on that because this will be the board agenda for an August adoption as well. Any questions about that?
I don't have a question about the plan itself, but at the safety committee, a number of times it has been brought up about having some sort of a visual indicator, even in a live event, not necessarily in a drill, where the public, any students maybe returning from an early dismissal or staff returning from lunch would know that there is a drill happening right now. And so like if there was a lockdown, we've had reports of having parents or, someone trying to come into the building when there was something happening, where if we had a visual indicator, and one of the suggestions was, a light on the outside of the buildings. And I know that when we talked about that, that was past our current budget cycle for this year. I don't know if you guys have had further conversation about, maybe pushing that to the forefront for, the next school year to think about budgeting that. I think it's a good suggestion. I think it would be useful to have, and something would have to be connected to some sort of a system. So I know it's probably a lot more complicated than it seems like just a light on the outside of the building. But I think it was a valuable suggestion for us to look at and thinking forward.
It was, and also, so for example, phys ed classes, so everyone would be aware. So as part of our Smart Schools Plan amendment, we've been working with, looking for companies to overhaul our PA system, our announcements, and we met with 3 different vendors, and currently Ronco is the vendor that is doing a walkthrough of our buildings this summer. We've asked CSR to also, be involved because of even though it's not in the capital project, but because of the different things that are going on with the fire alarm, et cetera. So one of the questions for them is going to be, is there something that can be tied into, the announcement system, so that when someone's making an announcement, that they can also, press a button, and if not, because we did bring this up at an vote meeting, exploring additional alternatives. But yeah, that was brought up by a few. So.
In the district where I work, we use Parent Square to notify staff when there's an emergency. So everyone gets real time, whether you're in the affected building or not.
Right, so we utilize Parent Square, good idea, to inform everyone. Some of the difficulty and need for the flashing light might be, if someone's not checking right away, but that's also the practice that we should
Another layer.
consider, making sure everybody knows when there's a drill in one building.
And a resource that we already have, the light, the addition of the light. Just a thought. Any other questions on this?
So this is a short presentation. I don't have the school business official to turn to for this evening. We will be reviewing the building level safety plans during exec session at the next meeting, because I know all the changes are due to Mrs. Rumsey by August 2nd. And then both the code of conduct and safety plans will be on the final board meeting for adoption. But this will not, stop us from making sure that we're ready to distribute this during the school year. Okay.
Thank you. Any Board of Education discussion on agenda items? Community discussion on agenda items.
Do we have to?
We
Mhm.
need to add something to the agenda, so may I have a motion, please, to add a walk-in resolution, which will be numbered 7R. And Mrs. Rumsey, would you read that resolution for us?
I will.
Thank you.
It states, be it resolved that the Board of Education approve the unpaid leave of absence request of Ronette Morin from her position as senior typist at Abram Lansing School, effective July 25th, 2024 through August 25th, 2024.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Mrs. Gendron, Mrs. Giller,
Yes.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Mrs. Snyder.
Yes.
Ms. Gendron.
Yes.
Mrs. Carey.
Yes. So now we've added that, and
Yes.
can I get a motion to designate a consent agenda that the Board of Education adopts the following resolutions of the July 24th, 2024 agenda, items 6A through N, 7A through R, and 9A.
I'll make a motion.
Thank you.
I'll second it.
Mrs. Giller.
Yes.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Mrs. Snyder.
Yes.
Mrs. Gendron.
Yes.
Mrs. Carey.
Yes, but wait. We should have discussed the committees, so I apologize. We'll have to do that vote again
Oh,
after we discuss the committees. Going back up for a hot minute. We need to confirm committee membership. Last year, the audit committee was Mrs. Giller, Mrs. Paris, and Mrs. Snyder. And while Mrs. Paris is not here with us this evening, she did indicate she would like to remain on the committees that she was on last year. So she has signed up for the audit committee. Mrs. Snyder, would you like to stay?
Yes, please.
Mrs. Giller, would you like to stay?
Yes.
Okay. So Giller, Paris, and Snyder.
mhm.
Budget committee, this is a big one. Mr. Jackson and Mrs. Carey are both willing to give up those seats.
No.
Mrs. Jackson would like to stay on the budget committee. Anyone like to join the budget?
I would never dream of taking that, so it is all yours.
Okay, Jackson and Carey are budget. District safety, Mrs. Gendron, Mrs. Giller, Mrs. Paradis. I have a yes for Mrs. Paradis. Mrs. Giller? Should we come back to it?
I mean, I know that you are looking maybe to not increase your participation in all the, so, but I'm on the same committees as you are, so it's not gonna make difference. Right?
Sure.
I mean, the remainder of the committees other than the budget, I am already on with you.
So do you want to stay on?
I will stay on the safety committee, yes.
Okay, Mrs. Gendron?
Yes,
Okay, so the district safety committee stays as is. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, Mrs. Snyder,
Yes, please.
Mrs. Giller?
Yes, I can stay on that.
Okay,
We don't need.
don't need me, so I'll come off.
I think the only one, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only one that requires 3 is the audit committee.
Mhm.
Everything else can be 2.
Can be two. So make sure
Mhm.
everyone has a crack at all of them, right? So facilities, Mr. Jackson, stay.
Yes, please.
Mrs. Gendron, stay.
yes, please.
And Mrs. Paradis will stay. Policy committee, Mrs. Carey and Mrs. Giller. Anyone like to join the policy committee?
Mm.
Mrs. Giller?
I'm good.
Okay. I'll stay. Mrs. Snyder,
I would like to stay.
thank you. Mr. DeRose is staying by default. And wellness.
If-
Mrs. Jen, oh, I'm sorry, would anyone else like to join technology? Okay. Wellness Committee, Mrs. Gendron,
Yes, I'd like to stay.
and also Mr. Droz would be happy to stay.
I just want to let you know that the policy committee is very fortunate because we're hoping to have a summer meeting in that area.
Yeah, I did that once.
Very fortunate for the policy committee.
All right, now that we've.
Thank you.
Let's go back and vote on the agenda. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bernstein.
No, I'm sorry, I should have remembered. Okay, so Mrs. Giller,
So we don't need to stand it over again, we're just
we're
revoting.
just doing 6A through N, 7A through R.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Jackson,
Yes.
Mrs. Snyder,
Yes.
Mrs. Gendron, and Mrs. Carey.
Yes, so thank you.
Thank you.
Pointing that out, I forgot it.
I forgot. So,
Okay. Comments from board members on anything that's not on the agenda?
I would just like to say that we just accepted the resignation for Becky LaForest, and I just want to, put my heartfelt thanks out to her. She has really brought the position to where it is today, and we're very grateful for all of the time that she has put into the career education coordinator position here for the district. I think it has brought us to a place where it's becoming more mainstream and more everyday focused. And I just want to thank her for that.
I would like to second that.
Well said.
Exactly. Questions and statements from the audience? Anything not on the agenda? This was the first reading for,
No, I'm sorry, that should say second, I'm sorry.
the second reading for expense reimbursement, facilities planning, pesticides and pest management, and buildings and grounds maintenance and inspection policies. We second and adopt,
Yeah,
and they were adopted as well as having their second reading tonight. Okay, there's no other business, then can I please have a motion to enter into executive session at 6:24 PM to discuss the evaluation of Superintendent O'Shea? I'm so sorry, the dates of future meetings
August 14th,
are August 14th. Here
yes,
at Cohoes High School in the LGI,
yes.
parking TBD at 6 PM. Thank you,
I'll make the motion.
thank you,
I'll second it.
thank you.
Mrs. Gendron, Mrs. Giller,
Yes.
Mr. Jackson,
Yes.
Mrs. Snyder,
Yes.
Mrs. Gendron,
Yes.
and Mrs. Carey.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a safe evening.